Hi guys, sorry to interrupt your viewing, but please subscribe to the channel and like this video. Thank you.
The air inside the venue was thick with laughter, conversation, and the occasional clinking of champagne glasses as the wedding rehearsal dinner carried on in full swing, guests mingling effortlessly while waiters floated around with trays of appetizers and cocktails. The space was beautiful, lit with soft golden lights that reflected off the crystal centerpieces, every detail carefully planned to make this night feel like the perfect prelude to the wedding of my dreams. But despite the warmth of the celebration surrounding me, despite the love I felt from friends and family who had traveled miles to be here, there was a familiar, unshakable tension that followed me like a shadow. A weight that settled at the base of my spine every time I heard that unmistakable voice behind me. Margaret Whitmore, my soon-to-be mother-in-law, was an expert at turning any room into her personal stage, weaving through conversations like a queen surveying her kingdom, every movement measured, every expression calculated, every interaction laced with just enough false warmth to convince outsiders that she was the gracious, doting mother of the groom. But I knew better. I had learned, over the past 2 years, that her smiles were just distractions, her compliments always double-edged, her presence in my life more of a storm to endure rather than a gift to cherish. So when I felt the light touch of her hand on my arm, when I heard her signature hushed tone, soft, polite, but dripping with barely restrained condescension, I already knew whatever was about to come out of her mouth wasn't going to be kind. She leaned in slightly, just enough to make sure only I could hear her, her breath warm against my ear as she spoke. "The dress looks a little cheap, don't you think?" she murmured, tilting her head as if she were truly concerned, as if her words were meant as a helpful suggestion rather than an outright insult. "Are you sure you can even afford this wedding? I mean, I imagine a budget like yours must be stretched thin." For a second, the words hit like a slap, a sharp sting against my pride, a fresh cut on a wound she had been slicing open for months. But the moment passed almost as quickly as it came, because I had heard this before, had endured her passive-aggressive barbs more times than I could count, had spent too many evenings biting my tongue while she smiled sweetly and dismantled my confidence one carefully chosen phrase at a time. I had been ready to let it roll off my back, had been prepared to simply turn away and refuse to let her ruin this night the way she had ruined so many others. But before I could even open my mouth, before I could find the right words to push back, someone else beat me to it. Claire, my maid of honor, my best friend since college, had been standing nearby, pretending to be invested in a conversation about floral arrangements, but clearly keeping one ear on Margaret's latest attempt to humiliate me. And now, with a smile that was almost too sweet to be genuine, she stepped closer, casually resting a hand on my shoulder as she turned to face Margaret directly, her eyes gleaming with amusement. "Oh, don't worry," Claire said, her voice bright, cheerful, dripping with the kind of faux politeness that made my stomach tighten with anticipation. "The dress was a gift. From your son." The moment the words left her mouth, the shift in the atmosphere was almost instantaneous. Margaret's expression froze, her lips parting slightly as if she had just been physically struck, her confident posture faltering for the briefest of seconds before she forced herself to recover, blinking rapidly as if trying to process the unexpected turn of events. I didn't have to look around to know that people had noticed, that a few nearby conversations had suddenly died down, that guests were now pretending not to listen but absolutely hanging on to every word. Because for the first time, Margaret hadn't been the one controlling the conversation. For the first time, she had been caught off guard. She swallowed once, her throat working around the words she clearly couldn't form, her carefully composed demeanor flickering under the weight of her own miscalculation. Because she had assumed I was the weak one. She had assumed I wouldn't have a defense. She had assumed she would get away with it. And yet, here she was, standing in front of me, completely blindsided by the truth. Nathan had bought me this dress. Nathan had chosen it himself, had spent weeks working with a designer to make sure it was perfect, had surprised me with it just weeks ago because he knew how much this wedding meant to me, because he wanted me to feel beautiful, because he loved me in a way his mother clearly didn't understand. Margaret's jaw tightened slightly, her hand smoothing down the front of her silk blouse in a subconscious attempt to regain control, to steady herself before she could lose more ground. "Well," she said after a moment, forcing a tight smile, her voice a touch too high-pitched to be natural. "Isn't that just sweet?" Claire's fingers squeezed my shoulder lightly, a silent message that said, "She's scrambling." And for the first time in months, I felt it too. I felt the power shifting, felt the weight of her disapproval slipping off my shoulders, felt the realization settle deep in my chest that she wasn't untouchable, that she wasn't as invincible as she liked to pretend. And so, instead of reacting, instead of letting her see even a flicker of the hurt she had been trying to inflict, I smiled. A slow, measured, deliberate smile. The kind of smile that said, "You don't get to ruin this for me. Not tonight. Not ever again." The kind of smile that told her, without a single word, that this battle wasn't over. And judging by the way Margaret's fingers twitched at her sides, she knew it too. Margaret's expression remained frozen in place long after Claire's words had settled into the air, her forced smile still stretched across her face, but the tension in her jaw betrayed just how deeply the moment had rattled her. I could see it. The way her fingers twitched slightly against the stem of her wine glass, the way her eyes darted for half a second toward the nearest group of guests before she forced herself to look unaffected. The way her carefully curated facade was cracking at the edges despite her best efforts to hold it together. And as I watched her struggle to reassert control over a situation she had so clearly lost, I felt something shift inside me, something cold and steady, something that made me realize that this wasn't just about a dress or a comment, or even the wedding itself. This had never been about the wedding at all. This had been about control from the very beginning. The memories came rushing back so quickly it was almost dizzying, flashing through my mind in sharp, cutting waves, each one a reminder of just how relentless Margaret had been in her campaign to convince the world, and maybe even herself, that I was not worthy of marrying her son. I remembered the day Nathan proposed, the way his hands had trembled slightly as he held out the ring, his voice steady, but his eyes filled with so much emotion that I could barely breathe, the way I had thrown my arms around him before he could even finish the question, laughing through tears as I said yes over and over again. It had been perfect, a moment I had replayed in my mind 1,000 times since that night, but the moment we shared our news with his family, Margaret had found a way to sour it within seconds. She had smiled, of course, because that's what she did. She smiled while she sliced the knife in deep. She had reached for my hand, examined the ring for only a brief moment before letting out a soft, amused laugh, her perfectly manicured nails tapping lightly against the diamond as she said, "Oh, how sweet." I suppose Nathan wanted something understated. I hadn't responded, because what was there to say? I had seen the look in Nathan's eyes, the way his face had hardened for a split second before he swallowed it down, before he let it go, because that's what he had been doing for years, letting it go, choosing to avoid conflict, convincing himself that it was easier that way. And that had only been the beginning. The comments had started small, quiet, so expertly disguised as concern that even Nathan had trouble recognizing them for what they were. Margaret had an incredible way of making her insults sound like favors, her manipulations sound like wisdom, her cruelty sound like love. She had criticized everything, from the venue we chose to the guest list we curated to the dress I had originally wanted before Nathan surprised me with the one she had just insulted. There was always something, always a remark, always a comment, always a new way to remind me that I would never be good enough for the life she believed she had built for her son. And then there were the rumors. Margaret was a master at weaving stories so subtly that people believed them before they even realized they had heard them. At one family dinner, she had casually mentioned to one of Nathan's aunts that I had once dated someone wealthy in college, which was true, but irrelevant, before letting the conversation spiral in a way that left the entire room with the impression that I was only interested in men with money. Another time, she had sighed dramatically and mentioned that I had been so eager to move in with Nathan so quickly. Wasn't it interesting how fast I latched onto him? By the time I heard half of what had been said, the damage had already been done. The worst part had been watching Nathan struggle with it, watching him try to defend me while still trying to hold on to the belief that his mother wasn't doing this on purpose. Because to admit that she was doing it intentionally would mean admitting that she didn't just dislike me, it would mean admitting that she was willing to sabotage her own son's happiness if it meant she could maintain control over him. And the thing that nearly broke me, the thing that had made me question whether this war with Margaret was even worth fighting, was the day I had overheard her telling Nathan that he still had time to change his mind. I hadn't meant to eavesdrop, hadn't meant to hear what was supposed to be a private conversation, but I had walked in just in time to hear her sigh, her voice soft, gentle, filled with a kind of false concern that made my stomach turn. "I'm just saying, sweetheart," she had murmured, her hands clasped over his, her expression one of pure, perfect motherly devotion. "Marriage is a big commitment, and I just want to make sure you're really sure. It's not too late, you know. If you ever decide this isn't right, we can fix it. No one will blame you." And I had watched as Nathan's entire body had gone rigid, as he had pulled his hands away, as something in his eyes had shifted, not just frustration, but real, deep anger, the kind that comes from finally seeing something clearly for the first time. That had been my breaking point, the moment I knew that this wasn't about me at all. Margaret had spent years shaping Nathan into the man she wanted him to be, and I was simply the first thing that had ever threatened to take him away from her. And as I stood there now, watching her still struggling to regain her composure after Claire's effortless takedown, I realized something I had never truly let myself accept until this moment. Margaret wasn't going to stop. This wasn't just a phase, wasn't just pre-wedding jitters, wasn't just a mother struggling to adjust to change. This was a war she had no intention of losing. But the thing about wars is that they only work if the other side is willing to fight. And I wasn't going to fight her anymore. Nathan's voice cut through the haze of my thoughts, sharp, firm, angrier than I had ever heard him before. "Mom," he said, stepping forward, his jaw tight, his eyes locked onto her with something I had never seen before, a choice. And as I watched Margaret's expression falter for the second time that night, I knew she saw it too. Nathan's voice cut through the low hum of chatter in the rehearsal dinner, sharp and firm, carrying a weight that made everyone within earshot pause just slightly, shifting uncomfortably as they pretended not to notice the sudden tension settling over the table. His mother, who had spent years perfecting the art of passive-aggressive cruelty wrapped in delicate politeness, turned to him with an expression that was supposed to convey innocence, confusion, maybe even hurt. But the flicker of panic behind her eyes betrayed the truth. She had been caught off guard for the second time that night, and she didn't like it. "Nathan, sweetheart," Margaret said, her voice laced with carefully curated exasperation, as if she were scolding a child who had misunderstood something simple, something obvious, something that should have never been questioned. "I don't understand why you're looking at me like that. I was just making conversation with Emma, that's all. Honestly, this is getting blown completely out of proportion." I could feel the way Nathan's body tensed beside me, the way his fingers curled slightly into fists at his sides, the way his jaw tightened just enough for me to know he was holding back more than he wanted to say. This was the moment, the turning point, the line in the sand that Margaret had just stepped over without realizing she was walking straight into her own downfall. "No," Nathan said, his voice quieter now, but no less sharp, no less filled with controlled frustration that was on the verge of spilling over. "You weren't just making conversation. You've been doing this since the moment we got engaged. The comments, the rumors, the constant judgment, you've been trying to make Emma feel like she doesn't belong, and honestly, I'm tired of pretending I don't see it." The murmur of conversation in the background completely died then, as if the entire room had collectively decided that eavesdropping was now a priority, their focus shifting just enough that I could feel the weight of their attention pressing in from all directions. Margaret's smile wavered, her fingers adjusting the napkin in her lap, her mind working in overdrive to find a way to spin this, to make herself the victim, to rewrite the moment before she lost control of it entirely. "Well, if we're finally talking about the truth," she said, her voice lowering just enough to feign a forced calmness that was seconds away from snapping, then maybe it's time I stop pretending I don't see what's really happening here. Maybe it's time I stop biting my tongue and say what everyone else has been too polite to say. Nathan let out a slow, measured breath, tilting his head slightly as he studied her, waiting, preparing, knowing exactly what was coming next. Margaret straightened her spine, smoothing down the front of her dress before looking at me with an expression I had seen too many times before, a manufactured kind of disappointment, a condescending kind of pity. A look designed to make me feel like an unworthy outsider intruding on a world I had no business being part of. "I just can't help but wonder," she said, her lips curving into a tight, forced smile, "if this wedding is happening for the right reasons. If maybe, just maybe, Emma has been so insistent on rushing into marriage because she sees what Nathan can provide for her. A financially comfortable life, stability, a family name that carries weight. I mean, it's no secret that Nathan has always been generous with his money, and some people," she paused slightly, as if weighing her next words carefully, as if pretending she wasn't about to say something unforgivable, "know exactly how to take advantage of that." The room was so quiet now that I could hear the faint clinking of silverware being set down, the awkward shuffling of guests who had absolutely no idea how to react to what was unfolding right in front of them. Nathan inhaled sharply, his fingers flexing at his sides, and I could feel the anger radiating off of him in waves. But before he could say anything, before he could be the one to put an end to this, I decided I was done letting her speak for me. "You think I'm with Nathan for his money?" I asked, my voice calm, steady, filled with a kind of certainty that made her pause for just a second too long. Margaret's smile flickered again, something uneasy creeping into her expression, but she recovered quickly, tilting her head slightly, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "Oh, sweetheart, I didn't say that," she cooed, placing a delicate hand against her chest. "I'm just saying that people should be honest about their intentions. Nathan comes from a certain lifestyle, and it's only natural for people to be drawn to that." I smiled then, slow and deliberate, a kind of amusement curling in my chest that I knew she wouldn't understand. Not yet, anyway. "Oh, Margaret," I said, exhaling a quiet laugh, shaking my head just slightly before finally delivering the words that I had been holding onto for far too long. "You should probably do a little more research before you start assuming I'm after Nathan's money. Because if you had, you would have already known that my family is wealthier than yours." Margaret blinked, her lips parting slightly, her body going unnaturally still as if her mind had just short-circuited, as if she had just been hit with the one thing she had never considered, a reality where she wasn't the most powerful person in the room. The reactions from the people around us varied, some confused, some shocked, some clearly enjoying every second of watching Margaret's world unravel, but all I could focus on was the way her fingers gripped the napkin in her lap just a little too tightly. The way her perfectly curated composure was beginning to fracture in real time. "What?" she finally managed, her voice a little too sharp, a little too uneven, the first real sign of panic creeping into her carefully crafted performance. I shrugged, completely at ease now, because I had never been after Nathan's wealth, had never needed anything from her, had never been the gold digger she had convinced herself I was. "My family's company is worth nearly double the Whitmore estate," I said simply, leaning back slightly in my chair, watching as the full weight of my words crashed over her. "I didn't need to marry into money, Margaret. I brought my own." Margaret's face went completely pale, her lips pressing into a thin line, her breath uneven, her entire body frozen in disbelief. And in that moment, in the stunned, humiliating silence that followed, I knew without a doubt, this war was already over. Margaret's silence didn't last as long as I had hoped, but the damage had already been done, the carefully controlled mask she had worn for years now visibly cracking at the edges as the truth settled into her bones, making her sit a little too still, making her fingers clench just a little too tightly against the edge of the tablecloth. For the first time since I had known her, she was completely, undeniably off balance, forced to reconcile with the reality that she had spent years spinning a false narrative about me, only to find out that she had been wrong in every possible way. The tension in the room was unbearable, stretching out and heavy, suffocating waves, the kind of silence that made people shift in their seats, made them sip their drinks a little too quickly. Made them suddenly very interested in their silverware just to avoid looking at the disaster unfolding in front of them. I could feel the eyes of nearly every guest flickering between Margaret, Nathan, and me, waiting for whatever came next, waiting to see if she would admit defeat or claw her way back with another carefully constructed lie. And, of course, she chose the latter. Margaret inhaled sharply, smoothing her palms down the front of her dress, a forced, brittle smile stretching across her face as she let out a small, controlled laugh. The kind that was meant to sound casual but only managed to sound like she was barely holding back the panic creeping into her voice. "Well," she said, exhaling through her nose as if this was all just a mild inconvenience rather than the moment her house of cards had completely collapsed. "I suppose that explains a few things." Nathan let out a quiet breath beside me, his jaw still locked, his hands clenched at his sides, but he didn't speak yet, didn't interrupt her, didn't stop her from digging her own grave one word at a time. Margaret tilted her head slightly, giving me a look that I had seen too many times before, the same look she had always used when she was about to say something cruel but didn't want to be held accountable for it, the same look that said, "I'm about to lie. And you're going to let me." "I was never against you, Emma," she said finally, her voice sickeningly sweet, thick with artificial sincerity, a tone so carefully crafted it almost sounded real. "I was only trying to make sure you were strong enough to handle this family, strong enough to handle Nathan, strong enough to stand beside him when things get difficult. You see, I wasn't trying to push you away, I was testing you." I had to laugh at that, because the sheer audacity of her backpedaling was almost impressive, almost admirable in its absolute refusal to acknowledge the truth. "Testing me," I repeated, raising an eyebrow as I leaned back slightly, tilting my head just enough to let her know that I wasn't buying a single word of it. "That's interesting, Margaret, because from where I'm sitting, it doesn't look like you were testing me at all. It looks like you were trying to break me." Margaret's lips twitched, just for a second, just enough to tell me that the words had landed exactly where I wanted them to. Nathan exhaled slowly beside me, running a hand over his face before finally speaking, his voice quieter now, but no less firm, no less sharp, no less final. "Mom," he said, shaking his head slightly, as if he couldn't believe it had come to this, as if some part of him had still, even after everything, held on to the hope that she would see reason, that she would stop, that she would let him have this without turning it into a battlefield. "You don't get to rewrite history just because you lost. You didn't test Emma. You didn't push her to be stronger. You tried to make her miserable, and when that didn't work, you tried to make me doubt her. And when that didn't work, you tried to make everyone else doubt her instead." Margaret's smile tightened, her perfectly applied mask slipping further by the second, revealing something raw, something ugly, something desperate beneath the surface. "That's not fair," she said, shaking her head, pressing a hand against her chest like she was personally wounded by the accusation. "I was only doing what any good mother would do. I was trying to protect you." Nathan let out a sharp, humorless laugh, rubbing at his jaw before shaking his head again, his expression one of complete disbelief. "Protect me?" he repeated, his voice incredulous now, filled with something dangerously close to exhaustion. "From what, Mom? From marrying the woman I love? From having a future with someone who makes me happy? Because if that's what you think protecting me looks like, then I think it's time you accept that I don't need your protection anymore." Margaret's face paled slightly, her breath hitching for just a second before she forced another carefully curated expression of calm disappointment, as if she were trying to convince herself that she still had the upper hand, that she still had control, that she still had the ability to manipulate the situation back in her favor. She glanced around the room, realizing, maybe for the first time, that there was no one here who was going to step in and rescue her, no one who was going to rush to her defense, no one who was going to tell her that she was right and that Nathan was just being emotional. She was standing alone in a fight she had created, and she knew it. Her fingers curled against the napkin in her lap, her jaw tightening slightly before she finally let out a slow, measured breath and stood, pushing her chair back with just a little too much force, as if making a dramatic exit was the only thing she had left. "If that's how you feel," she said, her voice softer now, her last-ditch attempt to make Nathan feel guilty, to plant one final seed of doubt. "Then I suppose I have no choice." Nathan didn't flinch, didn't move, didn't break eye contact. Margaret inhaled sharply, smoothing a hand over her dress before lifting her chin, her final attempt at salvaging the last shreds of her dignity as she delivered the words that she had clearly been holding onto as a last resort. "I won't be attending the wedding," she said simply, waiting, expecting, hoping for some kind of reaction that would prove she still had power here. Nathan didn't react. I didn't react. The weight of her words settled into the air, but no one rushed to stop her. No one begged her to stay. No one even looked surprised. And in that moment, Margaret finally understood what real power looked like. Because for the first time in her life, she had none. The morning of my wedding was quiet in the way that felt more like peace than absence, more like relief than regret, more like the first breath of fresh air after stepping out of a suffocating room. There was no chaos, no whispered tension, no hovering presence of a woman who had spent months, maybe even years, trying to convince the world that I did not belong in her son's life. Margaret Whitmore had made good on her word. She had not shown up. And, to my own surprise, I didn't care. For the first time since I had become engaged to Nathan, I wasn't worrying about what she was going to say, what she was going to do, what comment she was going to slip in just loud enough for me to hear, but quiet enough for others to dismiss. I wasn't bracing myself for some last-minute ploy, some whispered remark meant to chip away at my confidence, some carefully crafted performance designed to make her the victim of a wedding she had tried to sabotage. I wasn't waiting for her to turn a day meant for joy into one more battlefield in a war she had already lost. Instead, I was standing in front of the mirror in my dressing suite, the soft hum of voices from my bridesmaids filling the space behind me, the warmth of sunlight streaming through the windows, the sound of distant laughter from family and friends who had come to celebrate, not out of obligation, but because they wanted to be here. I smoothed my hands over the fabric of my gown, the one Margaret had once sneered at, the one she had tried to use as a weapon against me, the one Nathan had chosen because he knew what would make me feel beautiful. It was almost funny, in a way, how much time I had spent dreading her presence when, in reality, her absence was the greatest gift she could have given me. The ceremony was everything I had hoped it would be: intimate, heartfelt, filled with laughter, filled with love. There was no tension, no forced smiles, no thinly veiled insults disguised as concern. There was no pressure to impress someone who had spent so long convincing herself that I would never be enough. Instead, there was only Nathan, standing at the end of the aisle, watching me with a look that made my heart ache in the best possible way, a look that told me that none of Margaret's opinions had ever mattered, a look that said that this, right here, was exactly where we were meant to be. When I reached him, his fingers slid easily into mine, his grip warm, steady, the kind of touch that had always reminded me that I wasn't alone, that I never had been, that I never would be. His eyes flickered over my face, soft, searching, as if he were waiting for me to give him some kind of sign, some indication that I was okay, that I had let it go, that I wasn't standing here still carrying the weight of his mother's disapproval. And I wasn't. I smiled then, not out of defiance, not out of victory, not out of any need to prove a point, but simply because I was happy. Nathan exhaled slowly, his shoulders relaxing, the tension he had been carrying melting away as he lifted our joined hands slightly, pressing a kiss to the inside of my wrist before whispering, "You look perfect." And for the first time, I believed it. The reception was filled with warmth, with celebration, with the kind of unfiltered, uninhibited joy that only comes when the people in the room truly love each other, when the air isn't thick with pretense, when no one is waiting for the next carefully disguised insult to land. There was no cloud hanging over the evening, no hushed murmurs of disapproval, no judgmental glances across the room. There was only laughter, only music, only the sound of glasses clinking together as friends and family toasted to a future that felt lighter now than it ever had before. Margaret's name barely came up, except in brief, knowing glances between those who had seen everything unfold, those who had witnessed the long war she had waged and had quietly celebrated when she had been forced to walk away from the battlefield. There was no sadness, no longing, no guilt over the empty chair that had been left for her at the family table. She had made her choice, and for the first time, we had made ours. At some point in the night, as I stood near the edge of the dance floor, watching Nathan twirl my niece around in dizzying circles while she laughed so hard she nearly collapsed, Claire appeared beside me, nudging my shoulder lightly, her grin as wide as ever. "Can I just say," she murmured, taking a slow sip of champagne, "this might be the most relaxed I've ever seen you at one of your own events." I let out a breathy laugh, shaking my head as I watched Nathan let my niece climb onto his back, piggybacking her around the dance floor while the band played something slow and melodic. "That's because, for the first time, I don't feel like I have anything to prove," I admitted, glancing sideways at her. "And honestly, it feels really, really good." Claire's expression softened, her gaze flickering toward Nathan before turning back to me, something almost proud in her smile. "You finally stopped chasing her approval," she said knowingly, raising her glass in a mock toast before taking another sip. And she was right. I had spent too much time trying to fit into a world that had never been meant for me, too much energy trying to win over someone who had never intended to let me in, too much of my heart trying to love someone who had never seen me as anything more than a threat to the control she had spent years maintaining over her son. But she had lost. Not because we had forced her out. Not because we had retaliated or schemed or played the same game she had. She had lost because she had made herself irrelevant. Nathan made his way over then, his chest still rising and falling slightly from all the dancing, his hand sliding easily around my waist as he pressed a kiss to my temple. "Happy?" he asked, his voice quiet, "just for me, just to make sure, just to confirm that after everything, after all the battles and all the tension and all the years of trying to be accepted, I had finally let it go." I looked up at him, at the man who had chosen me over and over again, at the life we had built despite everything, at the love that had never once needed permission to exist. And I smiled. Completely. Because some people think love is about control. But real love? It doesn't need permission.